These people are the first and true residents of Kansas. Yep, you heard me right, but they were bullied by America. It's a sad story, and I'm here to tell it. Very few remained of the Osage Nation after enduring nearly a century of forced relocation and displacement by the U.S. government. After being forced out of their fertile lands in Kansas to a barren reservation in northern Oklahoma, hope seemed lost until the discovery of oil in the late 1890s. Overnight, the remaining 2,229 Osage members became some of the wealthiest people in the nation, but soon they all started dropping like flies. In the early 1920s, oil was discovered beneath the reservation land of the Osage tribe in Oklahoma. Overnight, the Osage became some of the wealthiest people in the United States. Because of the displacement they suffered in the early years, the US government had agreed that the Osage owned the rights to any minerals found on their land, including oil. This happened also because no one expected anything valuable to be in the land, but as it turned out, they were mistaken. At first, the tribe began leasing their land to white oil men, and the money poured in. The Osage were living luxuriously with large homes, automobiles, and even white servants, a stark reversal of the racial hierarchies that dominated the rest of the country. But the Osage's wealth came with a dangerous caveat. Many were deemed legally incompetent to manage their own finances simply because they were Native American. Instead, white guardians were appointed to control their money. Among those who rose to prominence in the Osage community was William Hale, a former cowboy who positioned himself as a benefactor and protector of the tribe. He donated generously to schools and hospitals, calling himself a friend of the Osage. He even signed his name with the title Reverend, though he was never ordained. Hale seemed to be a pillar of the community, but as the money continued to flow, darker forces began to stir. The Osage were not just wealthy, they were targets. In May 1921, Anna Brown, a young Osage woman known for her wild flapper lifestyle, went missing. At first, her family hoped she was simply off enjoying another night of dancing and bootleg liquor. However, when her decomposed body was found a week later near a creek, the truth was far more chilling. Anna had been shot in the back of the head, execution style, but as they would soon find out, this was only the beginning. Anna's sisters, Molay and Rita, were left devastated, and their mother, Lizzie, deeply suspicious of the tribe's sudden wealth, which died just 2 months before Anna. Many believed and accepted that the cause of her death was heartbreak. But the deaths didn't stop there. Around the same time, another Osage man, Charles Whitehorn, was found dead with 2 bullet holes in his head. As the Osage community began to sense something was terribly wrong, the body count only grew. From 1921 to 1923, Osage members and those connected to them started dropping like flies. Mysterious illnesses, fatal gunshot wounds, and violent deaths became common. One Osage representative sent to Washington, D.C. to investigate the murders was found naked and stabbed nearly 24 times. The violence culminated in February 1923 when Molay Buckart's last remaining sister, Rita, and her husband, Bill Smith, were killed. They died in a horrific explosion that leveled their home. Bill, who had been outspoken about bringing the killers to justice, survived the blast but died days later from his injuries. In less than 2 years, Molay Buccart lost both her sisters to brutal murders, and her mother's death was now suspected to be from poisoning. By this point, the killings were called the Osage Reign of Terror. The scale and ruthlessness of the murders were refined, and worse, local law enforcement was utterly failing. As time went on, people started to realize the entire investigation was corrupt. Even outside investigators took bribes. Also, the Oklahoma governor himself got impeached for dirty dealings with oil men. It seemed that the entire system was stacked against the Osage people. But there was one man determined to uncover the truth, W. Vaughn, a local attorney who had secretly been gathering evidence on the murders. In June 1923, he was summoned to the bedside of a dying Osage man who had been poisoned. Vaughn recorded the man's final confession, believing he had finally cracked the case. But on his way back, Vaughn disappeared. Days later, his body was found beside the railway tracks, his neck broken, and all of his crucial evidence gone. The killers were striking down anyone who got too close to the truth. By this time, 24 Osage members and a few white men connected to the investigation had been murdered. Anna Brown, one of the first victims, was even discovered to have been pregnant at the time of her death, adding to the horror. It was clear that the killers were ruthless and local authorities were terrified into silence. Anonymous threats kept them from taking action. The Osage were desperate for help, even as it looked like they would never get any. But not long after, the people were introduced to the newly formed Bureau of Investigation, led by J. Edgar Hoover. Hoover teamed up with Tom White, who was the head of investigation. It would be a long time before investigators connected William Hale to the murders. You see, William Hale had meticulously positioned himself to siphon the wealth of the tribe. The murders centered around Molly Bucket and her family, with her husband, Ernest Bucket, deeply implicated. He wasn't just Molly's husband, he was also the nephew of William Hale, fiercely loyal and controlled by his uncle. So why did he have each family member removed? The idea was that Molly could inherit their share of the Osage mineral rights, and Ernest stood to gain everything if something were to happen to her. Tom White, the lead investigator, unearthed damning evidence that tied Hale and his cronies directly to the crimes. He discovered forged insurance policies, financial fraud, and a string of mysterious deaths that pointed back to Hale's ruthless ambition. Outlaws like Dick Gregg, once part of the local gang, even admitted that Hale had solicited them to carry out the murders, but some refused when it involved killing women. One chilling revelation came when Bert Lawson, another criminal, confessed that Hale had personally hired him to plant the bomb that killed Molly's sister, Rita, and her husband, Bill Smith. Ernest, Molly's own husband, had been on the plot from the start. But as the investigation tightened, Molly became increasingly isolated, her health deteriorating as rumors swirled that she was being slowly poisoned. A local priest, alarmed by her absence from church, received a desperate message from Molly. Fearing for her life, the priest warned her not to drink liquor. Still, the investigators had little evidence to really get Hale. All they had was a link from someone who wasn't even trustworthy. Meanwhile, William Hale was pulling every string he could to avoid justice. His influence stretched deep into Oklahoma's political system, and it seemed that the trial would end in his favor. However, just when things seemed to be falling apart for Tom White and his team, it got worse. Ernest Bucket, who had previously confessed to his role in the murders, shockingly retracted his testimony. Tom White's last hope rested on a local criminal named Kelsey Morrison, another criminal. However, Morrison, despite his shady past, decided to stick with his testimony. He directly implicated Hale in the murders. Soon, Ernest Bucket, under intense pressure and realizing he could no longer protect his uncle, flipped once more. This time, he decided to testify truthfully, revealing Hale's role as the mastermind. Ernest Bucket, after flipping on William Hale and providing crucial testimony, was sentenced to life in prison with hard labor. As for William Hale, he was sentenced to life in prison. As for Molly Bucket, she survived after losing her two sisters to brutal murders, and her mother, Lizzie, died under suspicious circumstances. And to think that her husband played a key role in everything was beyond heartbreaking. And as if her suffering wasn't enough, during the trials, Molly faced another devastating blow when her 4-year-old daughter tragically passed away. Molly would later divorce Ernest while he was serving in a life sentence in prison. Sadly, a surviving child lived under the shadow of her father's infamy. They were forever stigmatized for being related to one of the most despised figures in the Osage community. In 1928, she remarried, and by 1931, she was finally declared legally competent to manage her own finances and was recognized as a full American citizen. However, the toll of years of emotional and physical turmoil had weakened her, and she passed away in 1937 at just 50 years old. As for the investigators, Tom White later became the warden of Leavenworth Prison in Kansas, where he oversaw William Hale. In 1931, White narrowly survived a harrowing incident during a prison riot, where he was kidnapped, shot, and left for dead. Though he survived, the injury left him with a lifelong limp in one arm. White continued his career as a prison warden and passed away in 1971 at the age of 90. As time went on, William Hale was shockingly released from prison in 1947. He had served only 20 years and was released for good behavior. Despite being a free man, he remained defiant. He had been a friend of the Osage and never admitted guilt. He died in 1962 at the age of 87, still unrepentant. As for Ernest Bucket, he got released from prison in 1937, but he was sent back after robbing an Osage home. He was released again in 1959 and received a pardon from the state of Oklahoma in 1965. He lived the rest of his life in relative obscurity, moving back to Osage County before eventually settling in a nearby area. Ernest died in 1986, destitute at the age of 94. As for Dick Gregg, the outlaw who testified that Hale had asked him to kill Bill and Rita Smith, he met a violent end when he was shot and killed after murdering 2 Tulsa policemen in 1929. The same fate met Blackie Thompson, the outlaw who had implicated Ernest Bucket in the Osage murders. Thompson was killed by the cops in 1934. Till today, the Osage murders need to be told, no matter how upsetting. The case still has many unanswered questions, particularly around other unresolved murders. Hale was only directly connected to the deaths of Anna Brown, Henry Ryan, Bill, and Rita Smith. But there were many more suspicious deaths, like that of Charles Whitehorn, which may or may not have been related to Hale's scheme. Many of these victims had one thing in common: their valuable shares in the Osage Mineral Trust. The elders of the Osage tribe had suspected that a sudden fortune from oil wealth would bring trouble, and unfortunately, they were right. Without the oil money, perhaps these murders never would have happened. Do you agree? Let us know your thoughts in the comment section.